Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Alistair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast. This is where we like to bridge the generation gap by debunking myths, tackling stereotypes and sharing some practical tips on how you can build stronger intergenerational connections. Today we are joined by Mark Saxby. Now Mark has got a fascinating career in all of the things he's done. He started life as a journalist, enjoying an award-winning career with the BBC, before he set up one of the world's first specialist social media agencies in 2011. He's now taken that to a whole new level by setting up Positive Social, which is a charity that goes into schools across the UK, helping children make better decisions about how they use social media. And Mark, we're going to talk more about social media later because it's such a critical topic at the moment. There's so much talk about it, especially with our youngsters, and you know how the social media platforms maybe have far more of a role than they do at the moment in terms of safeguarding our youngsters. But first of all, I want to talk a little bit about you and about your generation, whether you identify with your generation or not.
What do you class as a generation, Alistair? I'm going to see that because I'm going to throw a question back at you. What do you class as a generation?
Well, if you tell me when you were born roughly, I will tell you which generation you are. I'll give you a couple of ideas of what that generation is, and you can tell me whether you think that's you or not.
So I was born in the early 70s.
Okay, which makes you a Gen X. And Gen X, the typical things that people talk about Gen X is they were, of course, the latchkey kid generation. They're very creative. They were resilient because they had to be. They were kind of like the kids who got home from school. No one was there. Both parents were probably working. Again, these are massive generalizations, I should say. They tend... On the whole, to be, again, a generalization of Gen X is that they are very resilient. They probably have, on the negative, a little bit less patience for those around them who are less resilient, hence the slight friction between them and Gen Z that people talk about. So that's a little bit. Does any of that resonate with you, or you think, no, that's a load of rubbish?
Well, I mean, obviously some of it is me and some of it's not me because that's the way life is. But it just seems so odd that we should lump together such a, I imagine, a massive, I mean, the phrase latchkey kids, that's well before, I would say that's before the 70s, at least in terms of, I when I used to go home, my mum was there. So I suppose I don't really identify with a lot of what you said. But I don't know, it's interesting, isn't it? The way that we see ourselves, I still see myself as being in my, late teens, early 20s. I might be 53, but I don't see it that way. I still feel like I'm really young. So I don't really kind of identify with a certain age range. I don't think, okay, here's somebody here, he's the same age as me, I'll have lots in common, because I find generally that most people aren't really like me anyway. So therefore, then I suppose I don't really identify with other people in or other generation or a generation in that way.
The reality is you're quite right. It's way too arbitrary to say everyone of the same generation is the same. And then all of a sudden the year gets to 1980 and all of a sudden you're a millennial with a whole new set of values and the way you think. But there will be things that will have framed your generation. So if you think of, for example, Gen X, you think of the TV that was around at the time. You think about the, health and safety at the time. You were at an age where seatbelts became mandatory during your childhood. There would have been attitudes about smoking. There'd be a lot of things that would have framed the way that you were brought up, and that will affect the lens that you look through in your life. And none of us can really escape that. It's how much of an impression that made on our lives, I think, as we were growing up. And of course, it will depend. Gen X is a long time. It's from 1965 right through to 1980. You've got 15 years.
And doesn't that really matter? That really gets affected by how your parents saw those things. So, did your parents not think it's outrageous to have to wear seatbelts, and therefore then that was passed on to you? What was your view of your parents? And I suppose it's interesting when I talk to some people of my age, like I was talking to one of my friends yesterday, and he said his dad never gave him a hug, would never hug him. Now he's like 3 or 4 years older than me, so he's a Gen Xer as well. But actually my parents did hug me. So actually I think it's often about how our parents treated us and what their worldview was, that then affected the way that we are as in our generation. And because my mum and dad were probably quite modern, and they were probably, they embraced technology. They would buy new stuff, and there was on the market. They didn't have lots of money, but they liked technology. I remember having a Sony Walkman quite early on. So therefore, then I think maybe that's the reason why I have more of a younger outlook, and I don't see myself as being part of a generation because my parents weren't of that. They evolved while maybe some of their generation got left behind.
And you're absolutely right. It's what I call the 5 circles of generational influence, where the overarching circle is one of the generation. And then you drill down to whereabouts are you? Gen X in the UK will be different to Gen X in America or in Eastern Europe. Then you drill down further and further and further. And you then eventually, you get to 2 children, even identical twins, and they won't have the same behavior types. So yes, you're absolutely right. There's massive generalizations, but there is a framing there. So it's really interesting that your framing was one of, your parents were probably a little bit more advanced in their thinking about, in terms of, Gen X, the sort of affection between parents and children was different to the way it is today. But your parents obviously were different in that. So that's really interesting, and that definitely frames you, I think, in terms of who you've become. So thanks for that, and thank you, by the way, for turning the tables on this podcast, making me explain myself. So that's a good tester for me. But let's move on to the work environment now, and the work that you did. Because you can't leave that BBC journalism behind, coming back at me with some questions there, which was, you can never let that go. But you then got into social media. You then decided, working in social media, that you were going to set up this enterprise. What was it that triggered you to sort of effectively change your viewpoint and the way that you were dealing with social media?
So when we started Status Social back in 2011, and there was nobody else really doing social media as a business in those days, apart from maybe putting a little bit aside, but there was very few, there was no specialists. And we had lots of success, loads of clients. We generated millions of pounds of sales for our clients. But then, it was during one workshop, actually. I was running I can't remember what it was, a social media workshop of some description. And I think one of the delegates mentioned about the negative effect that they were seeing on children. And I just thought, yeah, you're right. Actually, there is something there that's negative. You can see that negative element. And this is 10 years ago when we had this first conversation. So I could see then there was something that needed to be done. But of course, the question was whether there was a need. So we did a pilot into a few schools in the city where I live in Derby. And they all went down very well. But what was interesting is there was one particular school that I was recommended to get in touch with because they would be pretty advanced. And I called them and I said, oh yes, we're running this pilot, and would you like to be involved? And the person who answered the phone said, oh, we've got no social media issues in our school. And I thought, well, there we go. Clearly not everyone really is aware. And the pilot was great, as I say, went really well. We learned a lot from it. But then the trouble is then the business took off. And so, the charity side, we just didn't have time. I went into an independent school every year who invited me back in. So we kind of evolved the training and made it better and better. But that was all we did. And then me and my wife made a decision to slim down the social media consultancy so we could then create some time to run the charity. We registered it properly during COVID and then kind of went from there. And of course, this is now the time. Everyone's talking about it. We've got the ban of social media in Australia. You've got 2 people talking about banning smartphones in schools. Suddenly people are taking it seriously. And, even just a few days ago, we had one day last week, we had 5 inquiries from schools. Last year, we'd have maybe had 5 in a month. So to get 5 in a day just shows the acceleration. And that's from us doing very, very little marketing.
We saw in the survey that we did last year, the way that people communicate, and clearly the amount of hours some youngsters are spending on their phones, the fact that it's universal, the fact that peer pressure is absolutely massive. At the end of the day, when you and I at school, the peer pressure was, did you watch that show on TV last night? Where today it's, have you seen this TikTok video that's been around? And if you haven't seen it, then you're kind of like out the group. group. The thing that I'm really fascinated by is that you clearly have multiple audiences in your work. You have the schools, you have the students themselves, and then you have the parents. And one of the things that we know is you have to communicate differently according to who your audience is. So can you give me an idea of how those conversations go? First of all, we'll go through each of them because I think it'll be quite interesting to see what those nuances are. Let's start off with the schools. Clearly there's a demand for it. Schools are recognizing it now. But what are those conversations that you're having, and what are you maybe having to get across that maybe they weren't expecting you to say?
I don't need to sell anything to them. They come to us because they're having their teaching is being disrupted by social media issues. There was one head teacher told me that 95% of issues in his school were being caused by social media. So that's why we were so needed. So often when schools call up, like I had one a couple of days ago and said, we've just had a major issue involving, this was year 5s, that had another issues with year 6s. So that's why they needed us. So they're I think one of the things that they're probably maybe more surprised by, although when we explain it, they get it, is we say, we're not coming in to sell them to stay off social media, because we know social media is here to stay. We're just here to say actually how to use it in the right way so actually you enjoy your best life rather than let it be ruined by your phones or by social media. But generally, teachers are very on side. It's the biggest thing that stops schools from booking us is they're so overwhelmed with everything else they're trying to deal with, that then finding the time to get back to us, it often takes, a primary school can make an inquiry one day and give us the dates the next day. A secondary school can take months to be able to get through all the systems to get through to booking us. They want to, but they're just so overwhelmed with everything else they've got to do.
So let's deal with what people would perceive to me the most challenging audience to any form of discussion around social media. How first of all do you manage to get your message across to the students, and how are you effectively doing it in a way that resonates and sticks?
So there's 3 key areas we talk about. The first one is about challenging them on their own behaviour. Are they posting things that are inappropriate? Are they going, are they bullying other kids in WhatsApp groups? Are they using their privacy settings right? Are they damaging their futures? Second bit is all about do they want to be in control, or do they want the social media networks to be in control of their lives? Do they realise that doctors liken our addiction to social media as that experienced by crack cocaine addicts? And then the third bit is all about, are you living your best life? So we do an exercise where we say, right, imagine your perfect day. Who would you be with? What would you be doing? What would you be eating? What would you be drinking? What would the weather be like? And then we get them to in their groups to discuss it. And then we say, right, okay, I have everybody here. Who of you said I want to be on TikTok or Snapchat on my perfect day? And of course, the whole room goes quiet and somebody goes, you find one kid saying, well, why would we do that? And I say, exactly. And now I know you can't be perfect days every day, but you can enjoy your best days. And then at the end, they make commitments, and thousands, 8,000 children so far make commitments to change their lives. And their commitments are things like, I'm leaving Instagram because it makes me feel sad. I'm leaving TikTok because it's washing my mind. I'm going to spend more time with my mum and dad instead, playing with my dogs, doing artwork, things like that that make their lives more fulfilling. And the way we win them over is by, well, we're on their side. I go in there and I say, we're not here to say come off social media. What's really interesting is that when you give children a choice, when you say to them actually that you don't need to be on social media as much as you are, they like the fact they've been given a choice because they've never been given that permission before. In their minds, this is just what life is like. You get left by your parents and you end up spending loads of time on social media. But then when we say actually you don't need to, they change.
There's 2 things I'd love to pick you up on there, because first of all is the massive one, which is peer pressure. Because at the end of the day, if your mates are posting every 2 minutes, we saw that program last year that Channel 4 did when there were some students admitting that they had, like 3,000 messages or something on different platforms. So you first of all got the peer pressure element, that they feel they have to be engaging all the time with their friends and whatever. And if they're going to be popular, they've got to be seen keen to engage and so on. Then you get the differences of at home. We'll talk about the parents in a moment, but those who have parental controls at home and those who have a far more relaxed attitude at home. And then, of course, that in itself brings up a whole peer pressure. So how do you deal with that one with children?
People say to me, how do you know your sessions work? And I say to them, I don't. What I do know, though, is I know some will change, some children will never change, but actually I said never change. I thought some children probably never will change, but I think most of them will remember the sessions from many, many years to come. And when it comes to that point when they realise actually their lives can be different, or actually they want to make a change, because we've got in there and given them permission, they'll make that change at a later date. So I think when it comes to peer pressure, what happens is, yes, there'll be some there who will say, no, I don't want to be in the group. I mean, it was interesting. There was somebody so we do a social ambassadors follow-up, where what we do is we create groups of social ambassadors in the schools, and they carry on talking about social media, and then they inspire other children to do the same, to kind of change their own habits on social media, rather. And we had somebody in an ambassadors group last week, and she was saying how she dropped her phone, and her mum and dad were really cross with her, so they'd bought her a Nokia. And so she'd lost all the apps, and she wasn't on WhatsApp anymore, and all she had was text. And we said, oh, what's that been like for you? And she went, it's been really good. I'm loving it. And actually, I think when you have people like that who are emboldened to go and talk to other classmates about how their lives could be like, because there's another lad in that session who said he was on his social media for 18 hours a day. Now, the rest of the group went, what? 18 hours a day? So there's a kind of, in that way, you get the other side of peer pressure, where actually you realise you're the weird one for being on social media lots. Well, actually, the happiest person in the room was a person actually who's hardly on social media at all. So I think there's an element of rubbing off. But I think peer pressure will always play a part, and there'll always be some kids who are stronger than others. And, we had peer pressure when we were growing up. There was trainers, it was fashion, it was hairstyles. There's always so many. I mean, let's be honest, being a kid is hard. It was hard when I was a kid.
It always has been, you're right. And it's really interesting you say that thing about, if peer pressure can work both ways. And one of the things that's really interesting, because people watching this might be thinking, okay, this is really interesting in schools. It's all about the social media at schools and so on. What's this impact going to be when these students eventually come into the workplace? And of course, that is critical, because you're setting up a framework of new, more positive habits that then can reflect into the workplace when those students get there.
Absolutely, because one of the issues that we find, I was talking to an employer and he said, we no longer take on young people because they can't stay off their phones long enough. And so actually this issue of us neglecting our young people and not educating them, because I think education is the answer when it comes to smartphones and social media. There's no other answer. Banning is not an answer. It's got to be education. Is that if we allow these children to grow up and never be educated on how they can live their lives properly, then they're going to struggle in jobs, and they're not going to get jobs, and they're going to lose jobs, because they can't stay off their phones long enough. Interesting. One of the things that I find is that although we run parent sessions, is that often parents don't come to them. It's hard to get them along, and schools struggle to get parents to go to any kind of events at schools, let alone outside events. And so I created a thing called Be More Colin, where I go into workplaces, and what I do there is I encourage employees to recognise that if they spend less time on their mobile phones doing personal things during work time, they'd be more effective. They get away from work on time. They would have better mental health. They'd get to know their colleagues better. They'd stay in their jobs longer. They would then have that work-life balance be more separate. The benefits are enormous. So actually, as adults, we need to make the change as well. As a 12-year-old said to me in a recent session, how can I make my own changes in my own social media life when my parents are on their phones all the time? Well, that's why we need to change.
That's what I was going to bring up next, actually, is the parental factor, because you've got the peer pressure thing where some parents are are engaging and saying, right, there's set guidelines and so on. And if that's set up from a young enough age, they're just in that habit. We did our survey, as you know, last year, and it was somebody wrote in there that their 8-year-old daughter was receiving WhatsApp messages at 2:30 in the morning, and the parent knew because they kept the phone downstairs in the kitchen throughout the night, and the child wasn't allowed it in their bedrooms. But the parent of the other child wasn't having those same guidelines for their kids. How do you have those conversations where sometimes for parents it might be just easy to say, you know what, just do what you want?
Yeah, so it's interesting with the parent sessions, which we more commonly do online nowadays, is that we start off talking about kind of the negative effects of social media. Now, for instance, one of the great stats is that children who have spent an excessive amount of time on screens will have a thinner frontal cortex of the brain, which means then that as they get older, they won't be able to remember things because the lines between the elements of the brain have been broken. They'll be more likely to be stressed, depressed, anxious, sleep deprived, those sort of things. So the parents they're very much woken up to actually this is a serious problem. And then we go through kind of things that they can do, like have good conversations with their children. They can, make sure they're checking in all the time, or not all the time, but occasionally to find out what's happening in their lives, what they're doing on social media, understanding the networks themselves, things like that. But then the final section is all about setting an example. And we give some techniques and tips they can use to set an example. And what's fascinating is, just like on the student sessions, at the end of the parent sessions, we ask them to make a commitment. And the most common commitment is, I'm going to set a better example to my children.
Yeah, and I think that's really, really good. And that actually almost applies to bosses in organizations with their teams around them. It's what you see around you is often what you end up emulating yourself. So to put a bit of a business frame on this, what kind of advice would you give organizations about allowing the use of social media amongst their teams, and how, I'm guessing a certain amount is what is going to be good because that's inclusive and that allows them that little bit of freedom. But where do you draw those lines? So what kind of advice would you give to organizations about that?
Well, again, it's educating, isn't it? Educating their staff as to actually the being on social media, being on your phones when it's valuable is good, but when it's not valuable, why are you doing it, and what's the downside? So little things like, for instance, we have a basket, and this is advice we give to parents as well. We have a basket that we keep in our kitchen, where all the phones go, so we can hear them ring, but we don't actually, we don't see them. They're not being carried around the house with us all the time. And you could do the same thing at work. The biggest thing to stop you from looking on your mobile phone too often is actually being in a place where you can't see it. So in my office, I keep it behind me, and I just don't see it. So it means then that when if I get a notification, and it which is very unusual actually, but if it does, because most of mine are silenced, if it does, it'll come up on my screen, but I won't see it. So only when I turn around at set moments, like if I'm checking emails at 9, 12, and 3, if I was good at doing that as well, then I would then see it then. So those sort of things. So my average screen time generally is I try and keep it under half an hour a day. Some days it's been as little as 12 minutes in a day.
Wow.
The other thing I use is some really good apps. There's some good apps out there. One I'd recommend called Opal and one called OneSec. OneSec, and they're both really good apps just to stop you from picking up your phone without thinking.
Yeah, none of us can escape the irony that it's an app on a phone that helps you to do that. But
right.
And actually, I have to say the tip about turning off alerts is something that I do, because I'm a bit of a shiny new toy person. I'm working on something, I see an alert, and I have to go and look at it and whatever. And turning off all those alerts has been, sort of massively impactful for me to maintain focus on what I'm doing. And I think that probably can spread across all ages and things. So, Mark, it's been fascinating talking to you, and I know we spent more time probably talking about the effect on youngsters, but of course that is something that's going to then see them through the rest of their life and into their working lives. So actually you're doing employers a huge favour here by, helping to keep kids on a good, positive trajectory with their phone use. Maybe just a couple of final thoughts that you've got, some takeaways that people watching and listening can do that actually we can all use generally that will help us connect better with each other's generation when it comes to social media usage. How can we all do that so we become a far more interconnected family, workplace, and so on between those different generations?
Well, do you know something else? I'm too old for social media. That's a lie. Because actually the reality is that we all, if we're going to try and communicate with other people, we need to get on their wavelength. You know, when I was growing up, I really loved Pink Floyd. You know, and my dad didn't like them. He would moan about Pink Floyd. He would complain about Pink Floyd. And it just created a barrier between me and my dad. You know, with my children, I need to understand how TikTok works. I need to understand, and I'm not on TikTok, I'm not on Snapchat, but I need to understand how they work, because then at least I can have the conversation with them. And I think where we often go as adults, we think, oh, well, we're too old for social media, we're too old for Snapchat, so therefore then we don't even make the effort. And of course, if we want to have conversations with young people, we've got to be on their wavelength, and that means understanding the things that they enjoy.
I think that's great advice, and that's something we can all take from that. Mark, it's been absolutely brilliant talking to you. Just tell us a little bit more about where people can find you. We'll put this in the show notes afterwards, but where can people find a little bit more about your Positive Social and the work that you do, and also the business that you do as well?
So yeah, it's great. It'd be great to hear from people who'd love to support us, whether that's helping us get into schools, or we're a charity, so we rely on funding. So our website is positivesocial.org.uk, and our email address is hello@positivesocial.org.uk. And then Status Social, you can contact us again through hello@statussocial.co.uk. And I'm also on all good social media networks, but mostly LinkedIn is my key one. But I also dabble with X.
But not TikTok.
Not TikTok. I can't get my dances right. It's really annoying.
It's well, as you said, it is really interesting that the level of interest that we all need to take in what people around us are doing, and that's the beginning of any conversation that you always have. You obviously see, just a final thought. I'm thinking about the youngsters going into the workplace for the first time. And, so we're talking about maybe student graduates or leaving school, going into work and things. What kind of advice do you give them and future employers to be able to communicate more effectively, and how to get that balance right with social media?
I think it's the reason why most people spend a lot of time on phones and on social media is because they've not thought through the consequences of what they're doing. So again, it comes down to the whole thing about education. When you educate somebody into actually what the difference is. So there's a little app which shows you how much time you're going to lose in your life to your phone if you carry out your current rates. And it was an 18-year-old I was talking to, a 17-year-old, and he was on his phone, I think it was 6 hours a day. And we put his figures into his app, and bearing in mind, how old he might grow, he might get to be. And we worked out he was going to lose 17 years of his life. So let's work that one out. I said to him, let's say, for instance, you live to 75. Well, you've not really lived to 75, have you? You've really lived to 75 minus 17 years, because 17 years on your phone is not living. Is that really where you want to be? I think it's just that level of education. Is this really what you want your life to look like? Or actually, what are the fun things? What are the alternatives to spending life on social media and on your phone? And they're always better than just wasting time on a screen.
Wow, that's certainly given us something to think about. Mark, that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for your pearls of wisdom. And I like those practical tips as well about what we can all do to reduce our social media time, make it more meaningful whenever we do go on there. And also then how we relate that to employers, the workplace, and also, of course, in schools as well. It's been great. Thank you so much for being a guest today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks again for joining us. We'll see you again in 2 weeks' time. Bye for now.